Hello, I'm James, and today I'm going to speak on arsenic in cultural heritage objects. I'll address the history of arsenic as a coloring, some types of object in which arsenic can be present, and best practices for working with objects that contain arsenic. Besides being the favorite poison of many 20th century murder mystery novels, arsenic has a notable place in the history of design, decoration, and fashion. Arsenic, combined with other materials, can be used to create pigments and dyes that produce brilliant, vivid shades of green, which historically have been used on a variety of formats, from home decor to clothing. To begin with, what is arsenic? Arsenic is a naturally occurring metalloid element, atomic number 33, exposure to which can potentially cause a variety of short-term and long-term medical ailments. Over the long term, arsenic can be a carcinogen. A person can be exposed to arsenic through inhalation, ingestion, or skin or eye contact. The modern significance of arsenic for pigments and dyes began in 1775, when Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele discovered an acid copper arsenate, which was eventually to be called Scheele's green. He delayed publishing instructions on its manufacture, however, so that understanding of its poisonous effects could first diffuse. The next advancement in arsenate coloring came around the turn of the 19th century. Paris green, also called emerald green among other names, was first made in Austria around 1800 and commercially produced starting in 1814. This arsenic-containing green pigment, according to the Grove Dictionary of Art, can often be found in paintings dating from the 19th century and early 20th. Indeed, the 19th century was the height of arsenic-based colorings. In an analysis of environmental arsenic poisoning and the Victorian domestic ideal, P.W.J. Bartrip writes, "Any manufactured item colored green was as likely as not to have been dyed with arsenic, and in the mid-19th century shades of green were the height of fashion, especially for home furnishings and women's clothing." In his book, The Arsenic Century, James Wharton writes that arsenic was everywhere in 19th century Britain, quote, introduced purposely into many of the components of everyday life, with the result that people took it in with fruits and vegetables, swallowed it with wine, inhaled it from cigarettes, absorbed it from cosmetics, and imbibed it even from the pint glass. As for objects that are commonly held by cultural heritage institutions, pigments containing arsenic have historically been used to produce and treat books in different ways. Around 2018, researchers at the University of Southern Denmark were analyzing the composition of some early modern books to study the use of manuscript fragments in their binding, when they unexpectedly discovered that the covers of the books had been painted with an arsenic-rich pigment, apparently to cover up the manuscript waste used in the binding. Media coverage of this spurred the discovery of a similar early 17th century volume held by the Smithsonian that also contained arsenic-based pigments. In 2019, staff of the Winterthur Library in Delaware discovered that a number of vividly covered volumes in their collection contained arsenic and copper-rich emerald green pigments as part of their book cloth. Winterthur has since launched the Poison Book Project to identify more arsenic volumes and to promote best practices for handling, using, and storing them. Another decorative use of arsenic coloring that might be found in repositories was for wallpaper. The evocatively titled book, Shadows from the Walls of Death, by Dr. Robert C. Kedzie and published by the Michigan State Board of Health, was written to warn Kedzie's Victorian contemporaries of the dangers of arsenic-containing wallpaper, which it did by including over 80 actual samples of such poisonous wallpaper. As Shadows from the Walls of Death demonstrates, people of the Victorian era were not unaware of the dangers of arsenic in everyday objects. As mentioned, Scheele was aware of the dangerous effects of his pigment in the late 18th century. And 1 year before the publication of Shadows, Scientific American published articles on both the risks of arsenic-based colorings and the ubiquity of such coloring in common domestic objects. An 1873 article reports the results of tests the magazine conducted on household items that readers had mailed in, like calico cotton fabric and wallpaper samples. In all instances, sufficient traces of arsenic were found, quote, to prove the dangerous character of the articles presented, end quote. The magazine unfavorably compared these arsenic colorings to the older Sheila's green. And a decade before that, Dr. Arthur Hill Hassell issued his own warning on domestic arsenic in The Lancet that made the same basic pair of points. First, that a variety of everyday objects were colored with arsenic pigments and dyes, including bonnets, scarves, and other fabrics, candles, and wrapping paper, envelopes, and other decorative papers, including candy wrappers. And second, that these arsenic traces posed health threats, both to the workers who fabricated them and the public who consumed them. How can cultural heritage professionals safely handle, use, and store hazardous materials, like those that contain arsenic? First, it's useful to distinguish between the hazard posed by an object and the potential risks associated with it. Hazards are characteristics of objects. Risk is the degree of probability that a hazard will inflict harm or cause disruption to operations. You might not be able to eliminate an object's hazard, but you usually can reduce and mitigate the risks that it presents. There are some steps that should be taken with hazardous materials of any type. First, a policy addressing hazardous materials should be created and should align with an institution's overall occupational health and safety standards. A hazardous materials policy should address assignment of responsibilities, hazard identification, exposure assessment, health and safety risk controls, and hazard communication and training. A survey of the collection should be conducted to determine precisely which objects are hazardous and in what way. The same steps that should be taken with any kind of collection will also reduce risks and promote safety when it comes to hazardous collections, making sure that handling procedures are followed, correctly labeling objects and their enclosures, and keeping clean and orderly workspaces. And as a National Park Service's conservogram reminds us, training of staff in all of these procedures and techniques is critical. For materials that contain arsenic in particular, any contact with skin should be absolutely avoided. To prevent this route of exposure, along with inhalation, staff should wear personal protective equipment, including nitrile gloves, HEPA filter respirators, and protective smocks or suits. When in use, objects should be placed on protective surfaces that can be cleaned afterwards. Any waste that results from handling or testing for arsenic should be placed in sealable, impervious containers, labeled as hazardous waste, and disposed of accordingly. To store arsenic objects, the University of Southern Denmark researchers identified two acceptable arrangements. Objects are kept in storage boxes, which are stored in fume cabinets, or kept in sealed bags made of polyester that are kept in custom-made storage boxes. In either case, the storage boxes must be properly labeled with hazard warnings. I have two discussion questions for you to consider. First, do you think repositories should have a policy on hazardous materials? What should such a policy include? How would it relate to other policies of your repository or parent institution? Second, imagine you are the head of rare books at the Winterthur Library. A researcher requests to view a book in the collection known to contain significant amounts of arsenic-based pigment. How do you respond to their request? Generally, how does safety relate to accessibility? In making this presentation, I came across several interesting resources that I didn't use in the main body. I recommend checking them out if any of these topics interested you. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for the semester together.